next guest is an attorney, a member of the National Lawyers Guild, as well as the Committee to Stop FBI Repression, who has recently worked with Occupy Dallas. Here to speak about repression of activists in the U.S. is Dan Sullivan. Please welcome Dan.
Well, Mr. Meek's speech is more or less of a perfect introduction to mine. He talked about the canary in the coal mine and how the repression that's been directed against the Muslim community, if it isn't stopped, will spread. And in fact, the reality is that it has spread. And many of the same tactics that have been employed for years now, certainly since September 11th of 2001, against Muslims in the United States are now being employed against activists of various sorts. One really clear example of that, I think, there have been since 2001 something over 500 terror prosecutions in the United States. In all but 2 or 3, maybe as many as 4 of those cases, the terror plot, which was busted, began with an FBI informant. That is to say, the FBI was in on the ground floor. And the usual pattern of this will be that the FBI will identify a person, usually young, usually somewhat angry, usually, I hate to say it, but not too bright. And they'll approach this person and do everything they can to make them angrier and angrier and ask them, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Finally hint that they can put them in touch with people who have weapons, bombs, whatever. Eventually supply the person with probably inactive bomb material or something of the sort. Arrest them and send them to prison for the rest of their life. And that's been done in hundreds of cases in the United States, mostly against Muslims, but now the same tactic has been employed against activists of different sorts. So, for instance, at the 2008 Republican National Convention, 2 very young activists were imprisoned, not for decades, I guess because they were American and not Muslim and they were white, but for a number of years for building bombs. And a person who had been working with the FBI apparently for years had urged them on, had told them they needed to do tougher things, had suggested bomb-making methods to them and so forth. And this was not enough to keep them out of prison. The same tactic seems to have been employed against anarchists in Chicago. So it's very direct, not only repression, but the very same repressive tactics that have been used against Muslims are now being used against activists. And I want to talk briefly about what some of those are and about what they mean for us. So that's one, obviously, this called provocateurism. If you take the number that there have been 500 terror prosecutions and less than 5 of them have not involved an FBI investigation, or pardon me, an FBI informant, then it's 99% likely that if someone starts talking to you about making bombs, that person is somehow linked with the FBI. It's almost a statistical certainty. So that one is relatively easy to combat. Simply don't let anybody talk you into doing something stupid, however compelling a case it sounds like they make, because you will end up in prison. Because they're going to go right as soon as they get done with you, and they're going to call their handler, and you'll be busted real quick. So that's one that probably most people in this room, being relatively experienced activists, don't have to worry too much about. Another one that is much talked about, but at the moment doesn't seem to be that much of a threat, is what's known as House Rule 347. And this is a bill that makes it a felony, federal felony to protest inside certain designated zones. The designated zones are places near where a person protected by the Secret Service is speaking or where an event of national significance is taking place. And this is much talked about in the activist community because some of us do sometimes hold protests where the government would prefer that we not do so. And of course the government has a tendency to say you're welcome to protest and then designate a place out in the wilderness or behind a wall or something like this so that the protest will have as little effect as possible. So people push the limit on this, and usually if you get arrested for it, it's at most a criminal trespass charge in the state court. This is something that you potentially could go to prison for. So what does that really mean for us? If it starts to be used, we're going to have to be very careful about it. To date, it really hasn't been used. So at the moment, it doesn't look like we're looking at wholesale busts of activists, just maybe some sharper restrictions on where we can protest. And it's going to be a bigger deal for people who are taking part in demonstrations that are not legally sanctioned. Another one that I want to spend a little time on, because it has 3 activists in the Pacific Northwest in federal prison right now, is the grand jury. Now, who here knows what a grand jury even is? So a lot of you do, minority, maybe it looks like 1 in 4, 1 in 5. They're a very powerful institution, and the purpose of a grand jury is to bring indictments, that is to say formal accusations in criminal courts, and they're allowed to call witnesses in order to decide who to indict. And they're allowed to subpoena the witnesses and force them to testify. Now, increasingly, the government is using those to target activists, even in prosecutions for relatively minor things. For instance, the prosecutions in the Pacific Northwest seem to center around acts of minor vandalism, broken windows, and so on, which has sparked a major federal investigation, even though ordinarily, of course, the FBI does not concern itself with broken shop windows. And then people are called to testify, and they're asked to testify about their friends, about who they work with politically, about political connections, and oh yeah, secondarily, if they know anything about the broken glass. And if they refuse to do so, they can be and often are jailed for contempt of court. Now, you may think that as an American citizen, you have a right under the Fifth Amendment not to testify, the right to remain silent. And you would be wrong. You do, but only in certain circumstances. At the point that they agree not to use your testimony against you, you can be compelled to testify. As long as they tell you, well, we're not going to prosecute you, just your friends we're asking you to rat on, then they can jail you for months until you testify. And currently there are 3 activists, anarchist activists in the Pacific Northwest who are in jail for doing this and are refusing to testify. And those 3, and I'm going to get, I'm not coming up with the 3rd name, but it's Olenek, and it's Matty Pfeiffer, and one other gentleman whose name is just escaping me at the moment, are now being held in solitary confinement for reasons which have not been explained to them or to anyone else, in order to compel them again to give the FBI give the federal government anyway, detailed information about the local anarchist scene. So this is something that we do have to be careful about and be aware of. And there's another case that's very similar in some ways. It started in 2010 with a series of FBI raids on peace and solidarity activists in the Midwest, particularly in Minneapolis and also Chicago, and one in Michigan. And in this case, again, many activists were summoned to a grand jury in Chicago, and they were to be asked questions about their political affiliations, different organizations such as the Twin Cities Anti-War Committee that they were involved in, and they refused to testify. Now that grand jury is still sitting. These people may still be compelled to testify or face jail for not doing so. Indictments may be handed down in the case, but for the moment, and it's been more than 2 years, no one has been arrested. And I think that the major difference between the 2 cases is that the activists in the Midwest have had a more effective organization behind them, which has brought a great deal of pressure on the federal government not to jail them. And it's very unfortunate that the people in the Northwest don't have that. And I hope that we can see more support for those people, because I think it really can make a very big difference, keep someone out of prison, potentially. So that's the only answer that I have to that. Now, of course, that's not the only role of the FBI or other police agencies in dealing with us. We've all seen that in Dallas they will tell you you can't be in a certain place, run you out of a park with machine guns, whatever else it may be. They've been known, of course, to use brutality to discourage people from protesting. There is in Dallas now a statute which forbids posting a sign near a freeway, despite, of course, that if you drive down any freeway, you're bombarded by billboards, and a political sign can hardly be more distracting than some of the billboards you'll see. So those are things that we have to be aware of. And finally, of course, the FBI is very clearly, and law enforcement in general is very clearly at this point employing what are known as COINTELPRO tactics. COINTELPRO tactics means that they have people who work with them, not necessarily law enforcement themselves, but people who are working, I think the technical term is as confidential informants, who will enter a movement, spy on the movement of course, and also will attempt to create dissent within the movement, turn people against each other, and so on. And that, in my opinion, is a very effective tactic that they've employed to damage a lot of movements. It's most famously employed against the Black Panthers in the 1970s, but it is being employed against Occupy now, and any other successful mass movement can expect to face the same threat. So what I would like to ask people to do is to go to stopfbi.net, take a look at what's on there, get some updates about some things that are going on, and in particular the cases in the Northwest, and find out how you can help. Thank you.